I want to now welcome Tareq Abu Azzoum, who's an Al Jazeera English correspondent based in Khan Younis in Gaza, one of the very few journalists reporting daily from inside the enclave, documenting the humanitarian crisis and concerns over genocide. His frontline coverage has highlighted civilian suffering, overwhelmed hospitals, and the risk faced by Palestinian journalists who continue to report despite personal loss and danger. So I look forward to hearing his evidence now. Thank you, Tareq, for coming on to our inquiry today. If you could present your evidence now, I'd be most grateful.
Well, thank you so much for having me in this significant tribunal, which has been seen as a necessary step to draw general light about the ongoing genocide in Gaza that has been ongoing for more than 22 months. And I'd like to seize this opportunity to deliver a message of gratitude and deep appreciation from the people of Gaza to all British people who have been protesting, demonstrating, raising awareness about genocide. Saying, I have been told by people here to tell everyone there that you protest, your voice heard and seen from the heart of the genocide in Gaza, and basically what has happened to Gaza during over the past 22 months, nothing short of the deliberate dismantling of society, the systematic erasure of an entire population that has been really battered. What began as a military operation under the pretext of security has developed and increased into one of the most documented and public acts of destruction seen in modern history. We saw entire towns and villages being destroyed, significant portions of agricultural land being grazed by Israeli troops, and massive portions of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, electricity and water networks have been critically destroyed. The light of the ongoing Israeli genocide that acts here on the ground. And apparently Gaza is no longer an actor, also a laboratory of collective punishment. And it's worth mentioning that figures and statistics that are coming out of Gaza are really staggering, but they fail to capture the depth of human loss. I personally saw an entire generation being buried under the rubble of their destroyed homes and buildings. Entire lands have been destroyed by the Israeli military. I saw also families being wiped out completely in an airstrike. Within seconds, nobody left to report about what happened exactly in that area. And as I'm talking to you right now, there is a huge Israeli military operation taking place in Gaza. And just a few seconds ago, the Israeli military struck multiple residential buildings in a Tofah neighborhood, which is located in the eastern part of Gaza City. The initial deaths that we have got where 6 Palestinians were killed and over 50 others being wounded, and they remain, I think, under the rubble. This is a part of what has been taking place here in Gaza. And if we just take a look on the general sentiment and the general conditions people are going through, we can see on the ground that displacement is near total. Every surviving Gaza is really becoming a refugee once again, living in overcrowded shelters and damaged buildings and inside makeshift camps under scorching heat, struggling to find water or any sort of energy. And we can see that famine in the street is no longer a threat, it has become a lived reality. People are spending their entire time looking for food, lining up in front of the soup kitchens to get their hands on food supplies, or risking their lives by making difficult journeys and rescuing to the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid centers, either to be killed, shot, and sustaining life-changing injuries. So apparently what has been taking place in Gaza for the first time in history is genocide that has been screamed still ongoing till now. Palestinians, almost with nothing but with their smartphones, have been documenting and becoming the tellers of their own life and genocide. But the huge visibility genocide has gained since its onset back in October 2023 has not been translated into accountability. But on the other hand, it exposed the huge moral failure of the international system. But what has been taking place on the ground was not even be known for the international viewers without the courageous work of journalists who have been working in one of the worst places seen on earth in modern history, where they have been moving from one front line to another, trying to navigate truth, trying to hear the plight of people, to document their repeated displacement, the violent single destruction, and the unwilling campaign that is still effectively taking place in Gaza without any sort of respite. Journalists here in Gaza are witnesses, survivors, and target themselves. Israel, as everyone knows, has killed since genocide began over 247 journalists. Many of them were killed while trying to document Israel's atrocities. Others were killed inside their temporary shelters along with their family members, while those who remain steadfast on the ground are still determined to continue this humanitarian and vital work to keep information leaving Gaza, because without Palestinian journalists, truth will not be unearthed or even discovered. We understand that Israel is still banning the entry of international media outlets. This is another evidence that the truth must be completely covered here in Gaza, but the absence of international media outlets is also a method that Israel has been using over the past months in order to prevent the full picture from coming out from this trip. But local journalists on the ground have been doing extraordinary work to keep reporting what's been happening, despite all technical challenges that they have been facing on the ground. You know, we are currently operating from hospitals in order to get some sort of advantage of electricity and water services provided there. And that's why even these areas have turned recently to be some sort of massive placement shelters for families who have left everything behind them. They have nowhere else to turn. And till now, what we can see is a continuation of the brutality that is unfolding day in, day out, and it's getting worse as the time passes. It's also important to let our international viewers understand a huge and important reality that Gaza is no longer the place that we used to know. This area has turned into a lifeless wasteland. Significant towns and villages have been completely, right now, been under Israeli control. And such kind of operations are not designed only to meet some sort of military objectives being set by the Israeli military, but it also creates some sort of deterrent environment to push people out of the Strait, to relocate them in neighboring countries. It has been quite seen by the statements and conferences made by extremist figures in the current Israeli Prime Minister's government about the intention to reoccupy Gaza and to relocate Palestinians in other parts of the world. So this has been by huge acts of defiance from local civilians. And as I'm talking to you right now, I've got testimonies from civilians in Gaza City describing some sort of unprecedented humanitarian and security conditions. They are living just a few meters away from active war zones. They are moving from one red zone to another. And even if they decided to leave Gaza City, they will move to an area that has been classified currently as safe zone by the Israeli military, but they realize completely that nowhere in Gaza safe. Hundreds of people were killed in areas that were marked by the Israeli military as safe humanitarian zones, like Al-Mawaq area, which is only a few kilometers away from where I am at the moment. And people understand that there is no any kind of guarantee given for them regarding their safety. So that's why Gaza is still an active epicenter for bloodshed, for repeated atrocities, and people are still living one of the worst nightmares ever. They say that for us, survival is not about just living the next day. It's about how you can get food, get water, just to live the next hour. But it's a matter of a chance, not just for planning for tomorrow. So all of this that I'm sharing with you right now, I location in Gaza without any kind of warning. It
Tareq.
has created and really taking a huge global responsibility. That's a tiny part of the reality that is unfolding in Gaza.
Tareq, thank you very, very much for that very powerful statement, and wish safety to all your colleagues in Al Jazeera for the work that you're doing in Gaza, and our sympathies to the large number of colleagues that you've lost in the war. And so please pass that on to the families of the colleagues, if you would, please. Thank you very, very much for your submission to our inquiry today.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you. We now have to take evidence from Francesca Albanese, who I believe is coming online in one moment. Francesca is, of course, the UN Rapporteur for the occupied territories and has done indefatigable work in pursuing her mission, and has recently been prevented from entering the United States in order to present her evidence there. So she's having to do it all on Zoom. And so, Francesca, if I could welcome you to the Gaza Tribunal, which we're holding today here in London. I know you're under incredible pressure and very, very busy, so we're very, very grateful for you coming online and for the work that you do. So if you want to make your statement and presentation now, that would be excellent. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for having me and having my testimony at the Gaza Tribunal. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person at Church House. And at the same time, it's a great pleasure to be with you online because it's a very important occasion. And I want to thank from the bottom of my heart, Jeremy Corbyn, for making my participation possible, and also more broadly for initiating this tribunal by calling for an independent inquiry into UK involvement in Gaza, as well as to the Peace and Justice Project for their immense work in bringing it together. I think that this is an example that should be followed in every country where the government appears not to have taken enough measures to prevent the crimes that have been committed in Gaza and in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, to say the least, because we might learn, in fact, that it's not just mere abstention from action, but there might be active complicity in what Israel has been doing. And I also want to thank each of you present for lending your time, voices, and expertise to this urgent and vital demand for justice and accountability, reminding us that justice ultimately derives its legitimacy from people's conscience and our collective insistence that the law be upheld. I would like to take you now to the legal framework that, as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, I've been invited to deliver a testimony on. This is about the legal obligations of the British government vis-à-vis the situation in Gaza but also the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Ordinarily, I would put the situation on the ground in the OPT at the center and squarely in all our minds before turning to the legal analysis. However, in the interest of time, I skip this part on the understanding that many Palestinian experts and comrades have preceded me, so I will turn directly on the legal issues, skipping the facts. What I often say is that Palestine today is a crime scene. As I have laid out in my most recent report presented to the Human Rights Council in July 2025 on corporate complicity, and as I will be made clear in my upcoming report to the General Assembly in October on third state responsibilities, when we consider the legal obligations of states, it's critical to understand that we are not talking about occasional and isolated violations of human rights and certain matters of improper conduct, but rather we are facing a long-standing structural system of widespread and systemic oppression and exploitation against the Palestinians that has turned genocidal at the hands of Israel, and Israel wouldn't have been able to do what it has been doing and transforming an unlawful occupation into a genocide, into the theater of a genocide, without the active support of far too many states. For decades, the violations Israel has committed against the Palestinian people have been clear, increasing, and compounding. Most critical among them, the systematic denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, which, as the word itself says, means that the Palestinians have to determine themselves, by themselves, politically, economically, etc., without other people, being Israel, the US, the UK, or others, the European Union, telling them what they should be doing and doing within the little territory that remains to them to exist as an independent state. And of course, there is also the concurrent annexation of the territory through the unlawful use of force while sustained through an apartheid system. This is what the Palestinians are confronted with every day. Each of these violations goes to the very foundations of international law, constituting jus cogens, norms, and as such attract obligations upon states to ensure these violations are brought to an end. In other words, states, including the United Kingdom, have been on notice for decades of their obligations, and they have not acted accordingly. They have an obligation to help realize the right of self-determination of the Palestinians. They have an obligation to respect and ensure respect of international humanitarian law, and they have miserably failed this mission. Instead, business with Israel has continued as normal. As when I say business, I intend businesses proper, but also research, arms trade, intelligence exchange, and political support that has worked as covert for Israel's crimes and other violations of international law, including human rights violations. Now, this situation of illegality has been unequivocally confirmed by the International Court of Justice in its landmark opinion of 19th of July 2024, through which the entire presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory has been declared illegal on the basis of the sustained and serious violations of three jus cogens principles just mentioned: protection of the right of self-determination, prohibition of acquisition of territory by force, hence prohibition of annexation, and prohibition of maintaining an apartheid and racial segregation-informed regime. The court has said that the occupation must be dismantled in its entirety, and states have undertaken that this must occur no later than September 17. It is a few weeks from now, according to General Assembly Resolution 10/24. Among the obligations that the court laid out for third state was the need, quote, abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territory or part thereof, end of quote. And, quote, to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, end of quote. And this is paragraph 278 of the of the ICJ advisory opinion. I must emphasize here the issue of distinction, differentiation between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory that frankly has consumed endlessly the political discourse, and I'm saying it's almost irrelevant at this point. Compliance with these obligations need to concretely consider the fact that the court recognized that Israel's intention is to acquire sovereignty over the occupied Palestinian territory, and it's building infrastructure to integrate the settlements, the colonies within Israeli territory. In practice, this means that there is no meaningful distinction with the territory of Israel. In practice, this means that, as I demonstrated in my last report, the state of Israel does not distinguish these territories. It has an entire infrastructure of rails, water in pipelines, electricity grid, and roads, on top of the financial aid and the political measures that are taken to set up the companies. So it has an entire infrastructure and economy that is designed to displace and replace the Palestinian people. Here, I urge you to take time to consider the evidence I produced in my last report that lays out the integrated nature of all the sectors with this driving force of settler colonialism in what I call Israel's economy of occupation that has turned into an economy of genocide. Legally, this creates a requirement on states like the UK to seize all trade, all investment, all economic relations with the state of Israel. All ties with Israel must be cut. This is what it means to comply with international law, and obligations to assure the third parties, corporations, charities, individuals, not to engage with Israel either, including universities. Alongside this, the court has issued provisional measure orders in January 2024, reinforced by two subsequent sets of provisional measures, and made explicit comments to third states in the matter of Nicaragua versus Germany concerning the risk of irreparable harm to the right of the Palestinian people under the Convention, as well as other violations of international law. Minimum, these measures put all states, including the UK, on notice of their duty to prevent genocide and the risk of complicity in genocide and other international crimes and serious violation of international law in case of non-compliance. With the issuance of the arrest warrants, all the more for senior Israeli leadership by the International Criminal Court, these obligations and risks have been further confirmed. Again, I want to pause here to emphasize the issue of distinction. The International Court of Justice, in its order for provisional measures, doesn't make a distinction between specific conduct that is genocidal and not. Such a distinction is arbitrary. It is Israel's entire use of force in the Gaza Strip and the occupied Palestinian territory broadly that risks to be genocidal or otherwise criminal in nature, and states must act accordingly. To put it very simply, there is no good Israel and bad Israel according to which side of the green line the ties have an effect in. It is the state of Israel that is committing crimes that must cease. It is therefore the state of Israel as a whole which must be addressed and see.
Francesca, we seem to be having trouble with the technical here. You went offline for a bit there.
Of all ties and relations, otherwise they go in their crimes. Now, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, but it comes and goes.
I'm sorry.
It's not your fault.
No.
I think we only lost you for a few seconds. So if you can repeat the last point you made.
Yes, absolutely. I was saying that the Court of Justice refers to the fact that it's Israel's entire, it's an important point, so I want to restate it. It's Israel's entire use of force in the Gaza Strip and the occupied Palestinian territory broadly that risks to be genocidal or criminal in nature, and states must act accordingly. There is no good Israel and bad Israel according to which side of the green line the ties have with the, for example, with the UK government have an effect into. It is the state of Israel as a whole, as a state that is committing crimes that must cease. Therefore, it is the state of Israel as a whole which must be addressed. Imagine today to be discussing, does the UK have faced responsibility, liability, or complicity in case of connection, military support, exchange of intelligence with apartheid South Africa in 1990 or 1991, 1992, would the UK have today relations with South Africa before the end of the apartheid? Well, depending on the answer, we would assess the responsibility and the lack of compliance with international law of the UK, and same thing with Israel. So the core international rulings and actions that I've referred to must also inform the more specific obligations by which the UK is bound. Most relevantly, the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which prohibits the transfer of arms to be used in breach of the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, among others. The frequent use of arms in the commission of great breaches of international humanitarian law, for example, violence by Israeli forces, soldiers, or Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians, and the above-mentioned legal context lead to the conclusion that nothing short of a full arms embargo on Israel will suffice for the UK to start meeting its legal obligation. Finally, as a state party to the Rome Statute, the UK must comply with ICC requests for arrest and surrender of indicted individuals found in its territory as per Article 89 of the Rome Statute. This obligation fits into the UK's broader obligation under Article 86 of the Statute to cooperate with the ICC. And given ICC's arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, the UK is legally obliged to surrender these Israeli officials to the ICC, but also to initiate its own proceedings against people who might be responsible for crimes. I conclude by saying all this creates a situation in which the retention of ties by the UK with Israel is unacceptable. The longer the UK retains these ties, the more it contributes to legitimizing and normalizing the illegal and the festering of impunity. This failure to abide by long-standing international obligations alone might be sufficient to establish a case for criminal complicity in the actions of Israel. Indeed, lesser conduct, such as presence and moral support, has been found to meet the criminal threshold for complicity for individuals before international tribunals. And with this, I conclude, and I thank you very much. I'm sorry if there were some technical glitches.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for your contribution and your very important testimony here. Just a quick question in relation to the effect of the UK's non-compliance with international law on the whole system of international law. Of course, its compliance along with its other allies. What does this mean for the international legal system that we have now?
Well, there are, unfortunately, I will only have the possibility to answer this question, then I need to disconnect. But look, the answer can be given very briefly on two levels. First of all, government officials can be held individually responsible if found complicit of crimes, those who have authorized the continuation of economic ties with Israel, trade that they might have contributed to the commission of crimes, and arms trades, arms transfer, but also intelligence exchange. But also there is something broader besides the UK itself, is that by not protecting the international law-based order, somewhat the UK has contributed to its disfigurement and its erosion, which is something that frankly puts all of us in a situation of fragility and vulnerability to illegality. We have entered a phase where might makes right, and none of us has anything to gain from it. Thank you very much for having me.
We thank you for your contribution.
Francesca, thank you very much indeed and thank you for all the work that you do for the people of Palestine.
Thank you. Bye. Good luck to you.
I will introduce now our next three witnesses. The first one is Dr. Ralph Wild, who is an academic specializing in public international law. He is a member of the Faculty of Laws at the University College of London, where his research focuses on international legal framework governing armed conflict, human rights, and the administration of territory by international organizations. He has published widely and served as an expert on expert bodies, including the International Law Association. Following Ralph, Paula Gavira Betancourt is a Colombian human rights lawyer and advocate. She was appointed United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons in 2022. Previously, she directed Colombia's Victims Unit following the country's 2011 victim law and served as the presidential advisor on human rights, leading national reconciliation and reparation efforts. And the last witness for this panel will be Pedro Arroyo Agudo. He's a Spanish physicist, economist, and environmentalist. He's a professor at the University of Zaragoza and has worked on water policy and sustainability. In 2020, he was appointed the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. Ralph, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I'm Ralph Wild. I'm Professor of International Law at University College London. And an area of my academic work is the subject of Palestine and international law, on which I published in the Palestine Yearbook of International Law and the Journal of the History of International Law. Some time ago, I served as legal advisor to the EU and DFID-funded expert body to the PLO peace negotiators on internationalization and trusteeship being considered then for a peace agreement, based on my book on those practices implemented in other places in the world. I later worked as a legal advisor to the Palestinian human rights NGOs Al-Haq Palestine, Al-Haq Europe, and the Jerusalem Consortium on Human Rights. Last year, at the nomination of Al-Haq Palestine and the State of Palestine, I represented the 22 states of the League of Arab States in the advisory opinion case about the illegality of Israel's occupation of the Palestinian Gaza Strip and West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the occupied Palestinian territory, the OPT, before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. This year, I represented Bolivia in the current advisory opinion case before the same court on the legal rights of states and international organizations to enter and be present in the OPT to support the Palestinian people, and later served as legal counsel to Bolivia at the emergency meeting of the Hague Group of States in Bogota, Colombia. Last year, I also represented the Arab League and the Palestinian Human Rights Commission in the Palestine case before the International Criminal Court, and the Gaza-based Palestine Center for Human Rights, NGO, writing its submission included in South Africa's submission in the current genocide case against Israel before the ICJ. I speak today in an individual capacity only. In last year's advisory opinion, the ICJ adopted the position I advanced on behalf of the Arab League based on my academic publications, affirming a profound shift of approach to the situation in the OPT compared to that taken by Israel and most Western states, including the UK, aligning things with the approach taken by the State of Palestine and many states of the global majority. The court ruled that the Israeli presence in the OPT is illegal not only in its conduct, but also in its very existence. This landmark ruling was subsequently affirmed by a large majority of states in the General Assembly. As I argued and the court held, the Israeli presence in the OPT is illegal as a violation of the legal right of the self-determination of the Palestinian people and the legal prohibition on annexation of territory through the use of force. As a result, it must end as rapidly as possible. As I argued for Bolivia before the court in this year's advisory opinion, a necessary implication of the ruling that Israel's presence is illegal is that Israel lacks any entitlement to do anything in the OPT on whatever basis. In consequence, everything it does there is illegal, not just its abusive and genocidal treatment of the Palestinian people, which is also illegal, as serious violations of international humanitarian law and violations of the prohibition of torture and inhuman degrading treatment, racial discrimination generally, and apartheid in particular, crimes against humanity and genocide. This also means that Israel has no legal right to decide who can enter and be present in the OPT, nor to restrict what those present can do. The fundamental character of the legal rules violated by Israel in maintaining the occupation means that all states, including the UK, bear special legal obligations to suppress these violations. These obligations are entirely separate from and more extensive than the duties that the UK and other states also have to suppress the violations of international law in Israel's abusive treatment and genocidal treatment of the Palestinian people. They are also much more fundamental and wide-ranging, since they concern the presence in the OPT in and of itself as a general matter. What I'll say about these obligations is explained in full in an expert legal opinion I wrote for the Palestinian NGO Al-Haq Europe, based on the submissions I made for the Arab League in last year's ICJ case, and the adoption of those positions by the court and endorsement by the General Assembly. The legal opinion can be found on the website of Al-Haq Europe in the Research and Publications section. Legally, all states, including the UK, must do three things. First, take all positive steps within their power to bring Israel's illegal presence in the OPT to an end. This requires full spectrum sanctions against Israel and Israeli individuals. Second, not to recognize the illegal presence as lawful. Third, not to aid or assist in maintaining the illegal presence. This is distinct from the more generally applicable, narrowly relevant rule from the international law of state responsibility, which covers violations of international law generally, where all states must not help illegality by other states when the purpose for the help is to enable that illegality. Here, the issue is different. It is more simply an obligation not to aid or assist if that would enable the illegal presence to be maintained. Whether or not the intent behind this aid or assistance is to support illegality is irrelevant. The links between the Israeli presence in the OPT, on the one hand, and so-called Israel proper, on the other, the economy, society, military, natural resources, culture, tourism, education, etc., are multifaceted and inextricable. In consequence, it's impossible to disaggregate relations with the Israeli state and Israeli private actors to somehow identify discrete matters not linked to the presence in the OPT. Consequently, implementing the suppression obligations requires the UK and all other states to address Israel as a general matter. So with arms and intelligence sharing, the UK and other states mustn't provide any support to Israel whatsoever, not just support that might end up being used to commit serious violations of the laws of war, crimes against humanity, or genocide, since any support given is going to end up one way or another supporting the existence of the occupation. Likewise, given how the economic dimensions of the Israeli presence in the OPT are inextricably linked to the Israeli economy generally, the UK and other states must adopt a complete trade embargo against Israel as a general matter, including but not at all limited to an embargo of settlement products. Despite last year's ICJ ruling and its affirmation by the UN General Assembly, there is still a denial about, or at least a refusal to acknowledge, these fundamental legal issues on the part of many states, including the UK. Both the existential illegality of the occupation and what this means for their behavior. Even the current focus on genocide, which is, of course, vital, if conducted in isolation from the bigger picture, obscures the fact that even if Israel were not committing a genocide and other legal breaches in its conduct in the OPT, its presence would still be a breach of fundamental legal rules, and the UK and other states would still bear the fundamental legal duties to bring these breaches to an end. With the duty of non-recognition, then, what is needed is a profound shift of emphasis from non-recognition of the legality of certain conduct only, such as criticizing settlement expansion as illegal, to also non-recognition of the legality of the presence itself. This includes then a duty not to recognize as valid Israel's justifications for that presence. Obviously, annexation, but also including self-defense. Any state, including the UK, asserting that Israel has a right to be present in any or part of the OPT, including Gaza, on the basis of a right of self-defense, breaches this duty of non-recognition. The time is long overdue for all states, including the UK, to face up to the exceptional character of Israel's violations of fundamental legal obligations in maintaining its presence in the OPT, and the exceptional character of the consequential legal duty that they have to suppress this. Legally, they are not disinterested bystanders, free to pick or choose whether and to what extent they address the illegality of the presence. They are required to act, and in doing so, must be comprehensive. There's an urgent legal duty to depart from partial, selective, tokenistic, and sometimes entirely symbolic gestures and statements to concrete, effective, and comprehensive action. I'll say one final thing about the current situation in Gaza. Because Israel's presence in the OPT is in and of itself illegal, and two key consequences are, first, that Israel has no right to decide who can enter and be present there, and second, that all states, including the UK, have a duty to act to bring the violations of international law involved in Israel's presence to an end. One way that the UK and other states can discharge this duty is to seek the permission of the representatives of the Palestinian people to send a protective presence into the OPT, including but not limited to the Gaza Strip, and to escort the entry by others to provide urgent relief. So-called humanitarian intervention is intervention in a state against the wishes of the government of that state. This would not be that. Israel is not sovereign in the OPT, and its wishes are of no legal significance. If the necessary Palestinian consent were given, this would, by itself, be sufficient as a legal basis for such action. Endorsement by the United Nations General Assembly would be politically helpful, but legally unnecessary. Thank you.
Dr. Wild, thank you so much for that testimony. I know you have to rush, so I have one question only for you. Given the OCJ ruling on the illegality of the occupation, and given what you've told us today, what about British citizens that are living in the West Bank today? And what about non-citizens that want to come and visit the UK? Are the first group, are they carrying out a crime just by living there? And as British citizen can be brought to justice here in the UK? And two, are we, the UK, offering entry to people that are carrying out a crime by living in the West Bank, Jewish citizens?
The UK has a positive duty to take action in relation to all people within its jurisdiction, citizens and non-citizens alike, and also corporate entities, to ensure that those actors do not take action that in any way supports or benefits from the illegality of Israel's presence in the OPT. So that means a positive duty to regulate the conduct of these non-state actors insofar as that is possible, including, if necessary, through sanctions, through criminal sanction. And that would include, therefore, taking positive action to prevent anyone in the UK's jurisdiction, and British citizens in particular, from taking any action in the OPT, whether it is indeed living on stolen Palestinian land or serving in the Israeli military.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now have Paula. Is she
I think it's on Zoom.
on Zoom?
Paula on Zoom.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, here she is. Yes, the floor is yours, please. 7-8 minutes.
Thank you.
We hear you. You can speak.
You can hear me?
Yes.
I cannot see you, but okay. So good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this critical moment in history. We are here because the law demands it and because humanity demands it. International law is unambiguous. An occupying power may displace civilians only under the most exceptional circumstances. That is, when it is strictly necessary for civilian safety or imperative military reasons. Absent these conditions, the forced displacement of civilians is no longer a security measure. It is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. And today in Gaza and across the occupied Palestinian territories, this law is being shattered in full view of the world. Since the 18th of March this year, more than 856,000 Palestinians have been forced from their homes, almost 2 million since October 2023. In the last 2 months alone, 120,000 more people were uprooted. We have heard testimonies of families displaced 15 times or more, 15 times or more. Children bombed while sheltering in schools and hospitals, elderly people with nowhere left to go. And let us be clear, this is not evacuation for safety. 80% of Gaza's infrastructure is gone, flattened. Israel claims to be upholding humanitarian principles of necessity and proportionality are simply unsubstantiated. And look at the facts. 86% of Gaza is under Israeli displacement orders or militarized control. The remaining 12%, the only land where civilians can go, is overcrowded, cut off from aid, and under constant threat. Since May 2025, at least 2,000 civilians have been killed while seeking food or water. Among the 60,000 dead and more, at least 18,000 children, 500 humanitarian workers, 326 UN staff. And killing the hungry while destroying the lifelines meant to keep them alive can only be one thing: a systematic attempt to dismantle civilian life. And when Israel proposes the so-called humanitarian cities on the Egyptian border, cities with no food, no water, no safety, we must name this plainly. It is an attempt to push Palestinians from their homeland, not to protect them within it. The scale of the mass displacement in Gaza today clearly reminds us of the exodus the Palestinians endured in 1948, and it has gone well beyond imaginable. But this displacement pattern is not confined to Gaza. In the West Bank, particularly Jenin and Tulkar, over 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced since early 2025, adding to the ones displaced since 23. More than 1,200 people, including 607 children, have been forced from their homes under demolition orders. And these demolitions are often based on accusations of an alleged lack of Israeli-issued building permits for Palestinians impossible to receive. So we see entire neighborhoods demolished, entire communities erased, and this is not random. It is not incidental. It is systemic. As my fellow Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese just said, we are facing a long-standing structural oppression against the Palestinian people. The immense scale of destruction to both human life and critical infrastructure not only deepens the humanitarian crisis, it also strengthens the case for accountability under international law. Under international human rights law, states bear the primary responsibility to respect, to protect, and fulfill the rights of all individuals within their jurisdiction or effective control. Where grave or systematic violations occur, such as arbitrary displacement, states may be held accountable. As an occupying power, Israel is bound by international humanitarian law as well. In Darfur, Sudanese leaders were indicted for displacement and the denial of humanitarian aid. These acts were framed within the broader charges of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In the Balkans, Serbian leaders faced charges for the deportation and forcibly transfer of civilians. The International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia made it clear that such actions are not military strategies. These are crimes against humanity. Israel's actions continue not because the law is silent, but because too many states remain silent. States that supply weapons, knowing how they will be used. States that offer economic and diplomatic cover while suppressing the voices of their own citizens who speak up, speak out. But international law is not to be twisted again and again. The Geneva Conventions require states to respect and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. That means stopping arms transfers when there is a clear risk of serious violations, cooperating to end grave breaches of the law, holding perpetrators accountable before international courts. The protection of the Palestinian civilian population is a shared responsibility of the international community. So today I call the international community, and particular states, halt immediately the armed transfers that fuel these crimes, protect Palestinian civilians with meaningful international action, not empty statements. Ensure accountability for those responsible under international law. To conclude, let me remind us of the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 5530 of 2024, which reaffirmed the Palestinian people's permanent and unqualified right of self-determination, including the right to live in freedom, justice, and dignity, and the right to their independent state of Palestine. History will ask what we did when civilians were starved, displaced, and slaughtered before the world's eyes. And let me be clear, doing nothing, saying nothing in the face of genocide is not neutrality, is complicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was very insightful on the displacement of the Palestinians in Gaza and on the creation of 86% of Gaza as a militarized zone where they cannot be present. Due to time constraints, we must continue now with our last speaker for this panel. I invite Pedro online if can you hear us, Pedro? We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. Are you muted?
Shares with
What?
Israel.
Ah,
During more than
it's a
50
video.
years of blockade, the crowded population of Gaza with 1.2 million inhabitants, and 1.7 are refugees who were violently expelled from their land homes years ago,
Needs to be louder.
was forced
We can't hear it.
pump 30 times more water than the aquifer naturally will pledge to meet basic needs. As a result, there has been intense salinization of groundwater due to marine intrusion. Furthermore, during this time, Israel blocked 70% of the materials needed to build sanitation stations, considering them to be dual-use. As a result, inadequate sanitation led to untreated sewage being discharged, contaminating the groundwater with fecal matter. In this context, until the start of the war, the only sources of drinking water were three large desalination plants operated irregularly due to power cuts imposed by Israel and sale of a limited amount of water by the Israeli public company Mekorot. In short, until the start of the war, the Strip had a drinking water supply that met only the needs of around 50% of the population. For this reason, as UN rapporteur, in my report to the UN General Assembly just before the war began, I denounced the violation of the human rights to drinking water and sanitation in the Strip for a large part of its population. Israel, as the occupying power, exercised and continued to exercise control over the airspace, territorial waters, land borders crossing, water supply, electricity networks, electromagnetic spectrum, and civil infrastructure in general in Gaza, and is therefore directly responsible for this breach of human rights in the street. When the war began, members of the government and senior army commanders declared clearly, directly, that they would cut off water, food, and medicines. And that is what they did and they are doing. The power cut caused and continues to cause the collapse of the desalination and sanitation plants that were in operation. In addition, 90% of water and sanitation facilities have been destroyed or severely damaged by bombing or blasting, including water wells, reservoirs, pipelines, irrigation, sewage stations, desalination units, treatment facilities. using, in fact, water as a weapon of war in clear violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. As rapporteur, I have received a lot of reports of deliberate attacks against water personnel and humanitarian workers, which have also been reported and documented in what can be considered a deliberate attempt to prevent reparations. As a result, 100% of sewage, around 130,000 cubic meters of wastewater are being discharged daily into the environment, infiltrating into the aquifer. In November 2023, in some of the most overcrowded shelters in the south of Gaza, there was only one toilet per 600 internally displaced persons and little to no running water. It is projected that the situation today is much worse, with most people not having access to a toilet, making open defecation the only option. Women and girls, as you can imagine, bear a disproportionately heavy burden. As limited wash facilities compromise menstrual hygiene and health, heightening risks of infection and social exclusion. Tens of thousands of women have given birth in the midst of this hell, in inhumane conditions, and without the means to feed their babies later. It is estimated right now that there are currently more than 60,000 pregnant women in Gaza. The population has access to an average of 5 liters of water per person per day, as a minimum, and lately even less. Furthermore, access is irregular and it depends on the tanker trucks that Israel allows through. The WHO establishes a minimum of 15 liters per person per day in extreme emergency situations. But the most serious problem is that this scarce water available is often salinated and contaminated with fecal matter. A few months ago, the UNICEF reported more than 70,000 cases of diarrhea per week in children under the age of 5, with severe dehydration, and also dysentery, bloody diarrhea, serious kidney failures, and even cases of smallpox and polio due to contaminated water. All of this in a situation of famine, extreme weakness, and without medicine or medical care, leads in many cases, especially in children and babies, to death. Cutting off drinking water and food is a real, silent bomb. Silent but lethal. In February 2024, Israel confirmed that its troops were flooding the underground tunnels with seawater, aggravating the salinization of the aquifer, rendering it unusable for years to come, even after the war ends. All these actions pursued by Israel could amount a pattern of conduct deliberately inflicting on the group condition of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, as mentioned in the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2. The military strategy in place and many of these actions not only violate the occupying powers' obligations under Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but also amount to a form of collective punishment expressly prohibited by customary international humanitarian law and envisaged as a war crime under Article 8 of the Rome Statute. As stated above, deprivation of access to food, including drinking water and medicine, is considered extermination, which is a crime against humanity clearly defined in Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Finally, Article 2 of the Genocide Convention prohibits acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, including deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Every day, we witness a flood of testimonies and evidence substantiating the essence of a genocide that we cannot ignore. Thank you very much.
What has Britain's role been in Gaza? And for this part of our inquiry, we will be welcoming the testimonies of Katie Fallon, who is the advocacy manager at the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, CAT, which campaigns against the global arms trade and the UK's role within it. She previously worked at Reporters Without Borders UK and for the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in London and New York. We are also honoured to welcome Richard Bergen, MP. Richard Bergen is the British politician who has served as a Member of Parliament for Leeds East since 2015, a member of the Labour Party. He was a Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and Shadow Lord Chancellor in Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Cabinet from 2016 to 2020. And I believe that Jean McAvoy is on his way to join us, and he's the Chief Reporter at Declassified UK, trained as a historian. His investigative journalism and filmmaking focused on British foreign policy, intelligence and arms trading. His work has been published in The Canary, Tribune Magazine and Open Democracy, and he has produced documentary films examining state and corporate complicity in conflict. The floor is all yours, Katie.
Thank you very much, Ahad. Hello, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to the panel and to Jeremy and everyone here for pulling this day together. In relation to UK arms to Israel, there is a catastrophic accountability gap and democratic deficit. It seems that multiple governments will go to any length to secure impunity, both for Israel's violations and for the government's complicity in those crimes. I frankly don't see how this issue could be any more urgent. I've been advocacy manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade for the last 4.5 years, and we're a 51-year-old organisation working to end the international arms trade. I'm also acutely aware that behind every figure that I mention, an arms licence and the FCDO IHL assessment processes, there are more than 2 million Palestinian people who have spent almost 2 years being near constantly bombed by F-35s, which contain 15% made in the UK, and a constant stream of spare parts. And I hope to honour them in this testimony. So just to say from the outset, this issue brings together a failed UK arms export regime and its intersection with Israel's occupation and apartheid decades long of Palestine. To start with kind of what we're sending, so single individual export licenses, they reach 633 million for the 10-year period from 2015 to 2024. And they cover things like aircrafts, technology, grenades, bombs, missiles, military training equipment. But in addition to those single licenses where we do have values, there's another 71 unlimited value open licenses. And this system lacks all transparency, so these open licenses allow for unlimited quantity, to often sometimes a number of different countries, and there's no end date for particular open licenses. So the F-35 parts, the parts for this stealth bomber jet, 15% of which are made here in the UK, are all on this open license. So that figure that I just mentioned and every figure that the government has mentioned excludes the value of these licenses. The UK is the only tier 1 partner, along with 7 other partners. So US is the lead partner, UK second level 1 or tier 1 partner. The others are Australia, Canada, Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway. So you'll see there's 3 EU countries, a number of different Western countries, all of which have made statements to say that they will maybe stop some parts going, but not the F-35 parts. So Israel currently has 45 F-35s with a further 30 on order, along with F-15s and F-16s that they're using. So that's, I think, an important point to point out. While I've seen in government statements, they might say things like, we send 1% of Israel's military equipment, but actually it's 45 jets. There are only 3 kinds being used. So when you look at it that way, is it really 1% or is it a critical part of the jets that are being used to drop bombs, which include 2,000-pound bombs? So 1% doesn't even near begin to cover the percentage of impact that these parts have. So we know that actually the true value of this open license for the F-35s is 572 million, including spare parts. So this almost doubles the 10-year figure that was being, that's kind of quoted from government. It's often quoted in the media, and it just kind of shows immediately the transparency issues with it in this system. So on the 2nd of September 2024, so this is the very day the Labour government made its announcement that there would be a suspension of 29 arms licenses. The Danish NGO Danwatch revealed that F-35 was used in July 2024 to drop 3 2,000-pound bombs in an attack on a so-called safe zone, so where Palestinians had been told by Israel to go, on Al-Mawasi, killing 90 people. And I think just to kind of try and bring some of this to life, this is a stealth bomber aircraft that is built to fight other jets in the air, bombing civilians living in tents with 2,000-pound bombs. Israel has also modified this jet to so-called beast mode, so it can carry additional munitions on the wings as well as the interior. A critical thing to take away from kind of the information about the F-35 is that they need a huge amount of spare parts to function. So it's a near constant stream of spare parts. One report states that Israel has used F-35s at more than 5 times the normal rate of peacetime operations. It has conducted thousands of sorties and flown more than 15,000 flight hours. One US official in December 2023 said they were working at breakneck speed to deliver more spare parts to the F-35s for Israel. And we did an FOI, which showed that in 2023, the license that the F-35 license was used 14 times, which is 3 times as much as any other year on record, so since the program began in 2016. And that's just for direct export of parts for the F-35s from the UK to Israel. So it doesn't include the global spare parts pool in the Netherlands. It doesn't include parts coming from the US. And we think most of that would have happened post-October 7th. So, a huge increase in the parts that are going. They are made all across the country. In Lancashire, the rear fuselage, the active interceptor system by BAE Systems in Kent. Durability testing happens in East Yorkshire. Martin Baker makes the ejection seats in Buckinghamshire. L3 Harris makes the weapons release mechanisms in Brighton. So it's really across the UK we are complicit with providing components for these jets, and there's 75 companies at least involved, and there may be more kind of smaller suppliers. But I think beyond kind of the F-35 program itself, it's not just what we are transferring, it's the processes that the government has implemented and how they have implemented that absolutely compound not just complicity for these specific crimes, any IHL violations that may have taken or war crimes taken place with these jets. It has contributed, I think, kind of critically to the government's denial that its obligation to prevent genocide has been triggered. So the suspension that happened in September, that came about because finally the government admitted that its own criteria had been violated, so that it must not grant a license if it determines that there's a clear risk that items might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of IHL. However, the F-35 they describe it as a carve-out. It's an exemption to their own criteria, is completely unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before, where there's an admission that the legal threshold has been reached, and then a complete departure from it. And I think just to maybe hammer that home, the criterion 2C is to prevent IHL violations from taking place. But what the government has done for decades really is to build in expected IHL violations and war crimes. It has, a margin that it's willing to expect. And what we've seen with Gaza is that margin is now through the roof, and there's no floor as to the crimes that they're willing to accept to civilians in Gaza. It accepted that the risk applied to the F-35s. It put that submission into court. But I think what's also interesting to note here is that when David Lammy made this announcement to Parliament, he didn't mention in his statement to Parliament that the government had stopped direct parts going to Israel, and now everything would be funneled through global supply pools and through the US. So the narrative that he wanted to convey is business as usual. Every part that you needed previously, Israel and also to the US, is going to continue. We're just going to find a different way to do it. He didn't even mention that they would be stopping direct parts in his address to Parliament. That came, later in supplementary materials. So I think it's important to see what ministers are saying versus there can be a big gap between what ministers are saying and legally what's been submitted to court. And in their submissions, they said that their excuse for this departure was that international peace and security would be affected by pulling out of the program. But that itself hinged on the government's argument that they could only stop parts going to Israel by completely leaving the program, and that it would be impossible to tell the other partners to stop parts going to Israel or for them to do it themselves. So this means that the position by ministers is that the UK cannot implement its arms controls in these types of agreement, that they're actually impossible, according to their own assessment of the situation, to make compliant with their international legal obligations like the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, and the Arms Trade Treaty. But what we know from what we've actually seen through the court case is the statements from civil servants and from the Department of Defense, they don't reference supply chain issues or technical problems. What they reference is the F-35 Memorandum of Understanding, that there needs to be consensus. Consensus is at the heart of the program between all of the different partners. So actually what they're describing is a political problem, a problem of political will. Amongst all of these partners, everyone bar the US has signed up to the Arms Trade Treaty, not one of technical difficulty. So I don't have too much time left, but I just want to finish on what I think is maybe the most important point. So the IHL assessment process that they are conducting, which I think you'll hear more about it from the next speaker, but to reach that conclusion that the threshold had been reached, that there was a serious risk, the government was looking at aid, provision of aid, treatment of detainees, and conduct of hostilities. And what it said was, yeah, there's violations on aid, and there's violations on treatment of detainees, but we don't have enough information on the hundreds, more than 400 violations of potential conduct of hostilities related IHL violations. So that will include everything to do with the jets, airstrikes, and bombs. And yes, just to say, in every single incident that there was, almost every single one, 99%. So in Kat's case on Yemen, we had 50% of cases. They said they didn't have enough information to make a judgment. This is 99. It's absurd. It's absolutely farcical. But what that did was allow them to say, yeah, the threshold has been reached, sure. But in terms of the jets, we're not admitting that there's any evidence that there's any problems with how they've used them. And then that builds into the genocide assessment, because what they have said, ECJU, the Export Control Joint Unit, has said, as far back as June 2024, so we're now more than a year, it's uncontentious that conduct which could in principle satisfy the physical component of genocide continues to take place in Gaza. So a year ago, they thought, yes, the material conditions for genocide are there. What they said was missing was Israel's intent. So it said it didn't see evidence making civilians the object of attack, or Israel deliberately targeting women or children. And apparently they don't care about men. And this is how they decided that Israel doesn't show genocidal intent. So while on one hand you've got all of the IHL incidents where you're saying we couldn't possibly know about Israel's intent, we don't have enough information, but then on genocide you're saying no, we absolutely know their intent. And intent is really the key thing with the IHL violations as well, because what they're saying, the information they don't have is on targeting, on proportional, unexpected civilian harm. So really, it makes almost no sense, and it's a stain on our collective humanity to deny the crimes that have been committed in almost 2 years of airstrikes. I'll just finish by saying, you know, this issue is going to continue to be ongoing in terms of arms, but also in terms of, for instance, the killing of people, the murder of people queuing for aid. So the Foreign Secretary was questioned on this just before recess in the summer and asked, have these incidents been included in the assessments that you're undertaking? And he admitted, yeah, we are doing assessments, but no, those are for an international court. And I actually think the Foreign Secretary got confused with his own lines, because yes, the government is saying a decision on genocide is for an international court, but I don't think that they're actually arguing that the ICJ has to make a decision for the thousands of people that have been killed while trying to get aid every single time. Those are quite clearly possible IHL violations. So, and he would not admit if they had been included or not when he was asked specifically. So the whole construction is so morally bankrupt that there's no way to sustain it without continuing to mislead Parliament and the public at the expense of Palestinian lives. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Katie, do you have...
One question from me, Katie. How do you find the truth about supplies of British weapons to Israel? Because it seems to me they're often quite obscure. The supply chain to manufacture anything is long and complicated. So are you able to identify the volume that is supplied to Israel, which may be made in Britain but go via a third party, thus evading the government's claim position that it is no longer supplying weapons to Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's actually where we're hoping to do our research kind of going forward, because it was actually in response to your own question, Richard, in June, where you were asking about, and it's also, this is John's research from Declassified, where the US apparently were transferring parts via Stansted Airport that the UK was then sending directly to Israel. And when asked, they mentioned about exemptions for the UK military to arms export controls. And they also mentioned, this was the Department of Business and Trade in this written question, they said, yes, we have stopped direct parts going, parts directly going to Israel, but not parts that the UK will be sending to Israel for onward transfer to other F-35 partners, which is implying that Israel is kind of a partner in the F-35 program, and that the UK is sending parts that then Israel will be sending on to other F-35 partners. So what this kind of seems to be hinting at is that there are transfers happening outside of the licensing system. And also, you know, my takeaway from the F-35 program, that the F-35 is the genocide jet. It has not been used at even near similar rates in any other conflict. So the legacy of this program is the genocide in Gaza. And I think we're hoping to do a bit more research to kind of estimate, you know, kind of when we're talking about the spare part supply pools, you know, in the US or in the Netherlands, in reality, a huge portion of them have to be going to Israel because of the rate that they're using and because no other partner is using it at the same rate. So I think there's kind of a little bit of stepping back here. And another thing to flag is that all of the jets in the F-35 program are getting systems upgrades. But, you know, the data of the jets' usage is going to be from Israel via Lockheed Martin on the genocide in Gaza. So the entire future of this program is kind of on the backs of Palestinians and on this genocide.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your work. Just one quick follow-up to that. When many of us have raised the issue of components for F-35s in Parliament, the government has consistently claimed that it's impossible to separate out the components made in Britain that go into the supply chain, which we would not want sent to Israel. They say they cannot separate them. Can you think of any other example around the world where a government would say it cannot control what happens to the vital components it makes to something as so significant as the F-35?
No, the only example I can think of is the F-35 program and the other partners to the F-35 program making the same claim. So, this is an emblematic case of a violation of the Arms Trade Treaty. It fundamentally goes to the heart of multiple different, the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, the Arms Trade Treaty. And I think, I'm sure I accept that there's going to be people with a different view to me or to Campaign Against Arms Trade, and I take that on board. But, arms trade executives and ministers, this was their opportunity to show that they're, the most expensive military program in terms of jets ever can be made compliant, that they say this brings peace and security around the world, and they failed. And the reasons that they submitted to court as to why they cannot stop individual parts going to Israel, the only kind of things that we could see that came out of what, a lot of it was redacted, but it was on consensus between the partners, the memorandum of understanding, the cooperation. What they're talking about is a political problem, political will not to stand up to the US and say that these are the treaties that we've all agreed on. And to me, it is not credible that this jet program, millions and millions of dollars and pounds have been poured into it, and there isn't an engineer who can come up with a technical way of tracking these parts. They have to be tracked anyway in case they are faulty, like anything, like when we see that like medicine needs to be pulled back from pharmacies. The same thing applies to jet programs. So no, I don't think that's credible, and it's not backed up at what the government submitted to the court.
So much. I don't know if you can answer this, but do you follow, how about Israeli arms companies operating in the UK like Elbit? Can you say a few words about that, and what is the legality of them producing the weapons here and then sending them back to Israel?
Yeah, we know that is happening. Certainly, and I think another interesting thing to note about Elbit is that they are going to, that kind of systems upgrade for the F-35 jet that I just mentioned, they are going to be doing a bespoke version of that for the Israeli modified F-35 jets. So even though we're mostly talking about BAE Systems, Elbit is not only, the UK government having contracts with Elbit, and there's kind of a huge one on the table at the moment that I know people have been speaking out about, including ourselves, but they're also now a partner in the F-35 jet program. So I think that very clearly shows it's not possible to be in this kind of circle of complicity and not, keep your hands clean. If all of this builds, and I think there's, I think other maybe speakers can address this, but the relation between the ICJ judgment and ending the occupation and the apartheid, as which of those companies are complicit in that too. So it's not just the IHL violations, it's their role as a business community that is sustaining this entire operation.
If I may, so as was made clear in the last session, the UK does indeed have a duty not to facilitate the Israeli military industry. And I was wondering, especially that DSEI is coming up, the role of the UK in marketing, purchasing military and tech and technology as well from Israel, and thereby allowing it to inflate its market and its capacity to fund it.
Yeah, and our position is that the Israeli arms companies that are going to be exhibiting, that will potentially have a pavilion, are complicit in war crimes and should not be allowed even visas to come into the UK. The government has said that it has not invited the Israeli delegation, but what we have, the research team has looked at is that the Israeli delegation decided not to come. So everything is being all we're seeing is actions in terms of words, and nothing that tackles, and I think this kind of comes back to the Foreign Secretary's statement, how he presented this suspension. Business as usual, nothing will change. Until, I've heard so many ministers who would be maybe speaking against what we were saying stopping arms exports is just a gesture. This is gesture politics. It's actually the only thing that isn't gesture politics. in every sense of the word, in terms of the F-35s, in terms of, you know, sustaining the Israeli military machine through marketing to every country in the world. You know, DSEI is one of the biggest arms fairs globally. So this is a place for Israel not just to market its weapons to the UK, but to everybody else. That's why, you know, I think that's why CAP believes that this issue is so important. And yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, I have just two statements that I'd like to confirm with you. So based on what the testimony that you just gave, so the British government and British courts have been prioritizing NATO obligations over their obligations under international humanitarian law. Would you say that would be accurate in one?
Yes, if it can even be said that these are NATO obligations, because the detail that we've seen, and there's a number of MPs here, I am not satisfied, and I don't think anybody else is, with the information that the Department of Defense has given to show what exactly is this threat to international peace and security. You know, they will mention Ukraine passingly, but the F-35 jets are not being used in Ukraine. So, and I've heard a number of people, the type of equation that you kind of get to is that the entire NATO system and the UK's relationship with the US rests on these crimes being committed against Palestinians, that if these crimes weren't happening, everything else would fall apart. So either that's true and we need to urgently change every single thing about this system, or it's not true. So even the NATO obligations I am not convinced by. And yeah, I think there's others. Richard, maybe you can, like, are we satisfied with what we've seen from the Department of Defense? And I don't think that we are. They won't even send the Business and Trade Committee the letter. They've asked a number of times.
Thank you very much. And you've satisfied my second question as well. So if we may move to Mr. Richard, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to address this important tribunal today. And I want to recognise, because I'm speaking as a Member of Parliament, I want to recognise the role that Jeremy Corbyn MP has played in bringing this important tribunal together. Over the decades, there have been many voices in Parliament for the people of Palestine and for justice for the Palestinian people, but nobody, past or present, has done more for the people of Palestine in the British Parliament than Jeremy Corbyn, and I want to put that on record. I want to briefly look at three things in my evidence. Firstly, the special hearings that we organised in Parliament into Israeli war crimes. Secondly, the political complicity of UK governments in Israel's war. And thirdly, the double standards of the UK government in its treatment of the Israeli war crimes and those by Russia in Ukraine. So firstly, in May 2024, I went to The Hague with my colleague Imran Hussain MP to meet the team of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and to deliver to the team a dossier of evidence of Israeli war crimes. The dossier followed a series of parliamentary hearings that we organised, attended by 70 parliamentarians from 8 parties in the spring of 2024. Our dossier was based on hours of transcripts from the evidence sessions, as well as written submissions from leading groups, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, United Nations Special Rapporteur, eyewitness accounts from a British doctor volunteering in a Gaza hospital, and UK humanitarian organisations with their presence on the ground in Gaza, who did not wish to be named for security reasons, as well as evidence from lawyers and academics. Now, the dossier found widespread international law violations under 4 categories of war crimes. Collective punishments, including starvation as a weapon of war, the forced transfer of the civilian population, attacks on medical facilities and personnel, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, including on journalists. What we heard was horrifying, and what the MPs there heard, they'll never forget. For example, the descriptions of the scenes from the hospitals in Gaza. Now, I don't have time here today to go into the detail, but I will provide this tribunal with the summary document that we published. Now, we did that in spring 2024, and even then, it was obvious that war crimes were being undertaken. And yet the government, then the Conservative government, was claiming there was no evidence of violations of international law. And despite the vast numbers of deaths, they'd undertaken next to no action. So for me, the key point is this. If two backbench MPs with their small teams could organise hearings where such evidence was presented, then the British government, with all its vast resources, was clearly and deliberately ignoring evidence of war crimes. It wasn't making the efforts to pursue the truth. It wasn't allocating staff to gather evidence. It was not fulfilling its moral duties. It was not fulfilling its legal duties. In short, it wasn't bothered. And that's an example of what I would label political complicity. We are witnessing a genocide, live streamed in real time, tens of thousands murdered with impunity, children starved, hospitals bombed, war crime after war crime. And some governments, including the UK, are helping to arm Israel, including with the parts for the world's most powerful fighter jets, as we've heard. That's one form of complicity. Complicity through military cooperation, as we've heard detailed. But I would argue that they're also complicit through the political green lights that they give Israel. The government should have been using every single tool at its disposal, from sanctions, which I'll come to using its role in the UN and elsewhere to force, not plead with Israel, to stop. Yet the political complicity, that political complicity has meant it has dragged its feet at every step of the way. It has not properly carried out the assessments needed to fulfil its legal obligations. It's obfuscating the reality, and it has not given MPs straight answers to simple questions. And all this appears to be so that it doesn't have to take the action needed. And this is in stark contrast to what it has done over Russian war crimes. By way of example, in September 2024, the new government suspended some arms export licences, 30 of over 350. While the government still does not give us clarity on what is still being exported, we do know, as we've heard, that F-35 fighter jet parts continue with nothing to stop these indirectly ending up in Israel's hands. What I find extraordinary about this decision is that when it was made in September 2024 by the new Labour government, Israel had already killed 40,000 Palestinians and launched over tens of thousands of airstrikes on Gaza. Yet in its own assessment of international humanitarian law violations from that September, the government had examined just 413 of these individual incidents when making its assessment. And of those, it found only one possible violation of international law. So I want to repeat that. By its international humanitarian law assessment in September 2024, the one that led to it suspending some arms licences, the UK government had found just one possible international humanitarian law violation, just one. And that's what I mean by political complicity. It's wrong for the government to have assessed so few incidents. It's also wrong to have used the methodology that they used, because the methodology that they used is only assessing incidents individually on a case-by-case basis rather than looking at patterns. For example, the systematic destruction of hospitals or mass population transfers. And I just want to read out the written parliamentary answer I was given in June this year when I asked the government again about this. The response from the minister responsible was as follows, and I quote, "Our international humanitarian law assessments have raised concerns about possible breaches of international humanitarian law in the areas of humanitarian access, the treatment of detainees and forced displacement. We have not been able to reach a determination in relation to the conduct of hostilities due to the lack of sufficient verifiable evidence. To determine a possible breach in this area requires access to sensitive, specific information related to individual incidents such as the intended targets, anticipated military advantage, and anticipated civilian harm, which is often not available to us. So the government has not seen anything in the conduct of this war, the bombings, the shootings, the tanks rolling in, that leads it to conclude even possible international humanitarian law violations, and that is because of a lack of information from Israel on why it is conducting these strikes. That's totally perverse. Why are we asking a state whose leader and defence minister were charged with war crimes to provide evidence about strikes that could constitute war crimes? Is the government writing to Vladimir Putin and asking him for information about Russian war crimes before taking action? Of course not. We've had a similar frustration with holding the government to account over genocide. For months, the government claimed it cannot determine whether there is a risk of genocide, as that is a matter for the courts. For example, I recently asked the government whether it had an assessment of whether Israel was in breach of the Genocide Convention. Again, I will read the written parliamentary answer I was recently given, which states, and I quote, "The UK's long-standing policy is that any formal determination as to whether genocide has occurred is a matter for a competent national or international court, rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. It should be decided after consideration of all the evidence available in the context of a credible judicial process." But that totally undermines the government's duty under the Genocide Act to proactively prevent genocide, because it's the Prevention of Genocide Convention, not the wait till genocide has been completed convention. Now, this is what I mean about the lack of transparency, the failure to do all they can, and what I call political complicity. And finally, I want to look at the issue of double standards. Our government rightly imposed sanctions on Russia, but next to nothing is done about sanctions on Israel. The government says that the UK has sanctioned over 2,500 individuals, entities and ships under the Russia sanctions regime, over 2,300 of which have been sanctioned since Putin's full-scale invasion. In contrast, for Israel, there have been just a handful of sanctions against two far-right ministers and against some extremist settlers and settlers' bodies, and only, I believe, for their action in the West Bank, not for the war on Gaza. And in the Foreign Secretary's statement in Parliament on Monday, when we were given the transcript of his statement by the clerks in the House, it refers to, in advocacy of the government's position being sufficient so far, that 3 sanctions have been brought against Israel. It said there have been 3, and it's totaled them up themselves, and it didn't take long to do so. That's why in November 2024, in line with the ruling of the ICJ, I organised a letter signed by over 60 parliamentarians from 7 parties, calling on the Foreign Secretary to impose widespread sanctions on Israel over its repeated violations of international law. We did not receive any response, so over the summer, I coordinated 85 MPs and Lords from 9 political parties to again make this call for sanctions. The call to suspend the UK-Israel trade agreement until Israel complies with international law, ban all trade in goods and services with illegal Israeli settlements, impose targeted sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes on all individuals and entities complicit in Israel's occupation, end all arms transfers to Israel, including F-35 components which can be used in violations of international humanitarian law, conduct a full review of UK-Israel relations to ensure no support is given to violations of international law. But as with this tribunal today, I won't be waiting on the government to do the right thing, because it will be through pressure from ordinary people, from campaigners and parliamentarians that we will secure justice. So next week, I'll be launching a new sanctions on Israel bill and forming a new parliamentary working group for sanctions on Israel. Thank you for your time, and I hope that the tribunals found that presentation useful.
Thank you very much. Do you have questions?
Could I ask a question? First of all, Richard, thank you very much for that very powerful statement you've given and the work you've done in raising particularly the legal issues, along with our colleague Imran Hussain, who I'm very pleased to see is here today and has also done a huge amount of work on this particular subject. In your meetings with ministers and civil servants under both governments with the Foreign Office, do you detect they are fully aware of the breaches of international law that appear to be taking place? Or do you feel there is a big cover-up going on and they're fully aware of it and don't want to admit it?
I think it may be the case that ministers have convinced themselves that what they're doing is sufficient. I think it's very notable that over the summer a line has developed. We've been consistently asking in questions in Parliament and in correspondence to ministers, why isn't the government bringing extensive sanctions against Israel in the way it has against Russia? Their original response before the summer parliamentary recess was to not answer the question. They now do have an answer to the question, which is they say, name a developed country that has brought more sanctions against Israel than us, because I find it quite offensive the way they say developed country, because obviously what they're trying to do there is to write out South Africa, Colombia, and other countries in the Hague Group out of the picture. And of course, if these matters end up in court, and if ministers have to end up finding themselves answerable to legal proceedings, then we didn't do sufficient, but neither did some other Western countries. It's not going to be, in my view, a valid defence. It may be that ministers have deluded themselves, but the consistent thing is that we don't get straight answers. Sometimes we don't get answers at all. And where we do get answers, as Katie said earlier, they're not straight answers. Whether that's because the government ministers aren't asking the correct questions at all, or whether that's because things are being deliberately concealed by ministers, I don't know.
Thank you again very much for this really powerful statement. I have a question regarding the legal departments in the government. I mean, in independent lawyers, there's almost wall-to-wall consensus that Israel is egregiously violating international humanitarian law and actually has violated the Genocide Convention. Do you get to see the briefings that the legal departments are giving the politicians? And are these legal briefings indicating that there is no violation and therefore I don't know how they reach such conclusions? Or are these legal briefings kept in the dark and all you get to see is what the ministers are telling you? Because I think it's very important for us to see what the actual experts in the Foreign Office and in the Defense Office are saying.
Now, we don't get to see the legal advice. Many requests have been made for publication of legal advice, and we just don't get that. What we get is answers at the dispatch box from ministers. And something I find very interesting on the question of legal advice and legal conclusions and legal duties is that we can have in the House of Commons a series of statements. We have where there's a statement on the situation in Gaza, followed by a statement about the situation in Ukraine. And we sometimes have the same minister answering both statements or giving both statements, answering questions from MPs. In the first statement, if it's on Gaza, it's not for us to determine whether or not there are war crimes because it's only for the due legal process and et cetera, it's not possible. And then in the subsequent statements to the House and questions being responded to from the dispatch box, suddenly it can be clearly said that war crimes are taking place, and that Russia's committed war crimes, fine, but that double standard where there can be a clear view on the legal position in relation to one country, but not another, is another example of what I'd call double standards. And we've pursued publication of the legal advice, and we haven't had that. So in that sense, not only is Parliament kept in the dark, but the public is being kept in the dark as well.
One follow-up question. I understand that Israeli legal teams are coming to London and advising your legal departments. Do you see the legal departments also seeking advice from human rights organizations here in the UK that have expertise on international humanitarian law and are more neutral, or is it only the Israeli teams that the UK government is seeking advice from?
I have to say I don't know the answer to that, and maybe Katie can shed some light. Is your organisation being asked for legal advice by the government?
Certainly not, given that we have taken them to court twice. But I think other colleagues, maybe from different organisations, I would be absolutely certain that the legal teams in Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have given every bit of, and including the Glan court case, the government was given thousands of pages of evidence. So they have seen, and there was interventions by Amnesty and also by Human Rights Watch and Oxfam. So they fully will have engaged with the government and given them every aspect. And these would include, testimony from their staff on the ground too, not just from based in London. Could I actually just add one very quick thing, just to kind of round this off? When I think about this assessment process, there's not millions of people in the Foreign Office, and there's not, it's not thousands and thousands of people that have access to this information. It's either dozens or maybe 100, and those people need to be held accountable, and they need to hold themselves accountable too. It's not, these are like genocidal documents that are stamping off everything that's happening. And I think I would make a direct call to the people who are involved in this process. Kind of Foreign Office or diplomatic groupthink is what's sustaining all of this, and people need to take a stand.
Well, we thank you very much, Richard, for your testimony on the bad faith, the misrepresentation of both reality and the law within the halls of government. And now we move on to Joan, please.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Hello? Hi, so I'm John McAvoy, Chief Reporter at Declassified UK. Thanks very much for inviting me to provide testimony. Today I'm going to present evidence that we at Declassified contend could implicate UK ministers in war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. The first thing I want to talk about, which has already been covered somewhat, is F-35 shipments to Israel. So it's well known that the UK is a key supplier of F-35 parts that go into global pools, which then supply Israel. But what is still not widely known is that the UK was directly transferring fighter jet parts to Israel throughout the first year of the Gaza genocide. So last year, Declassified and The Ditch revealed that 14 shipments of F-35 parts were sent directly from Britain to Nevatim Air Base between October 2023 and September 2024. At least 2 of those shipments took place under Keir Starmer's Labour government. Crucially, these shipments were sent from a Royal Air Force base in Norfolk, RAF Marham, making the British armed forces themselves directly complicit in the supply of arms to a state committing genocide. In September last year, the Labour government announced arms restrictions on Israel, suspending some 30 arms export licences and the direct supply of F-35 components to Israel. But these arms restrictions, we contend, were largely a smokescreen for business as usual. Shipping documents, once again obtained by Declassified and The Ditch, indicate that the vast majority, around 90%, of all F-35 exports from Britain are sent directly to the US, where they can be, onward exported to Israel. It's therefore highly unlikely that the ban on direct exports of F-35 parts to Israel will have made a significant impact on the supply chain of fighter jet parts from Britain to Israel altogether. And even after the September arms restrictions, F-35 parts bound for Israel were allowed to be shipped through London Stansted Airport. Inquiries to the Foreign Office about how this was allowed to happen remain unanswered. The Labour government's arms restrictions on Israel have functioned as a smokescreen for business as usual in another crucial way. In his announcement on 2nd September 2024, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy said that the suspensions would cover equipment for use in the current conflict in Gaza. We contend that Lammy's definition of for use in the current conflict in Gaza is fatuous and fundamentally misleading. So in terms of trainer aircraft, components for trainer aircraft were excluded from the arms suspensions because they're supposedly not for use in the current conflict in Gaza, even though Israeli pilots rely on UK-made parts to learn to fly the fighter jets, which are being used to annihilate Gaza. So shipping documents have revealed how aerospace firm Moog in Wolverhampton has sent at least 10 shipments of M346 Lavi components to Israel since December 2024, so after the restrictions. The M346 Lavi is a high-performance aircraft designed to train pilots to fly advanced fighter jets, including the F-16 and the F-35. So the UK government is therefore still facilitating the training of Israeli pilots who will go on to drop 2,000-pound bombs on men, women and children in Gaza. And it's not just parts for trainer aircraft that have been exported to Israel since Labour's suspensions in September 2024. Permoid, an engineering firm in County Durham, has sent over 1,000 ammunition containers to Israel since October 2023. Around 300 of those containers were exported in April 2025, once again under the Labour government. Most of these containers were sent to an Elbit Systems factory near Tel Aviv, which produces mortar shells for the IDF. So once again, the UK government would seemingly have us believe that facilitating the supply of ammunition containers, but not the ammunition itself, is a morally justifiable and legally tenable position. I now want to turn to Israeli military officers training in Britain throughout the genocide. After months of stonewalling from both Conservative and Labour governments, we discovered that Israeli army officers have been allowed to train in Britain since October 2023. This information was provided to us earlier this year in response to a Freedom of Information request after several refusals through the Freedom of Information Act. The Ministry of Defence said that fewer than 5 Israeli officers had trained at the prestigious Royal College of Defence Studies in 2023 and 2024. But we subsequently found that at least one of those Israeli soldiers graduated from the RCDS just last month. So even as recently as last month, the UK is training soldiers from an army that is actively committing genocide. And it's not just Israeli soldiers training in Britain. The UK government has welcomed several high-ranking Israeli officers to Britain since October 2023, often providing them with special diplomatic immunity to protect them from private arrest applications under universal jurisdiction legislation. That list includes, but may extend, because all of these visits were intended to occur in secrecy. So there may be many other Israeli military officers that have visited. But the list includes Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, the IDF's then Chief of the General Staff, who had been directing the Israeli military's operations throughout the Gaza genocide. He visited Britain in November 2024, and the Foreign Office provided him with special diplomatic immunity, protecting him from arrest for war crimes. Then there was Major General Oded Basiuk, head of the Israeli military's Operations Directorate, who was overseeing Gaza operations as well. He attempted to secretly visit Britain in January 2025, but Declassified managed to doorstep him outside Russia in London. And most recently, there was Major General Tomer Bar, the commander of the Israeli Air Force, which has been overseeing, the key player in the decimation of Gaza. Bar was subsequently identified in the chain of command of Israeli officers responsible for the killing of 5 Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza last month. He was allowed to visit Britain in July 2025, just 2 months ago. The final thing I want to talk about, well, I know it will be covered in broader detail tomorrow, is intelligence support. So there's been over 600 spy flights from the RAF since December 2023. These spy flights remarkably continued during the ceasefire early this year. The UK government's rationale for the spy flights is that they're supposedly looking for hostages and they have no offensive duties whatsoever. But at this time, the last remaining British hostage was actually being released. And this kind of destroyed the rationale for the continuation of the spy flights. And in fact, looked very much like the British government was continuing to spy over Gaza to help the Israeli forces prepare for a resumption of war, so had very little confidence in the ceasefire that they supposedly supported themselves. There's been several spy flights that have gone over Gaza either before or during massacres, and there are serious concerns about what intelligence the RAF is using in order to decide where they supposedly look for hostages, and whether any of that intelligence has been gleaned through torture of Palestinian hostages and captives, given we know about the pervasive and systematic use of torture by Israeli forces against Palestinians. Now, jumping back to a question that you asked Richard about the extent to which ministers are actually aware of the extent of war crimes in Gaza, one thing that shocked me is that in a Foreign Affairs Select Committee, it was admitted that the Foreign Office, when trying to review whether Israel is committed to complying with international humanitarian law, they were asked whether they've requested to see the footage from the spy flights. I mean, the Britain has had an eye over Gaza for much of this genocide. They can pick up communications. The Foreign Office minister said they have not even asked to see this footage. They have one of the greatest databases of genocide in recent history, yet the Foreign Office and the unit that is supposed to decide whether Israel is complying with the international humanitarian law has not even asked to view it, which I think is an incredible admission. My very final point is that it's worth noting that most of this information that has been cited now has been either ignored or suppressed by Britain's corporate media, which also needs to be investigated for complicity in this genocide. Thank you.
John, thanks for your evidence just then. What knowledge have you got of the flight paths of the RAF over Gaza? Are they covering the whole of the Gaza Strip? Are you able to identify what they were actually looking for? And has anything been published at all on it that you're aware of?
Yeah, so throughout, since December 2023, what would occur would the beach aircraft would leave RAF Akrotiri, they'd go over the sea and they'd turn their transponders off, so it would be kind of impossible to see exactly what their flight path is. But Matt Kennard at Palestine Deep Dive 3 weeks ago, one of the privately contracted the UK has contracted private spy flights now, and they forgot to turn their transponders off. And so you can see the kind of flight path that they are taking. So they'll fly over to Gaza and they'll basically encircle an area, because what these spy flights are proficient at is kind of hoovering up intelligence, hoovering up communications from the ground. And so they will circle a certain area of interest for about 3 to 4 hours, and then they'll return to RAF Akrotiri and, you know, presumably pass whatever intelligence they have of interest onto the Israeli forces. I mean, it's important to note as well, even if we take the UK government's justification for the spy flights at its word, that they're only, you know, tasked with locating hostages, then, you know, Netanyahu's justification for much of the war has been to locate hostages. I mean, we know that's nonsense. And in several hostage rescue operations, the Israeli forces have conducted hideous massacres. Around 270 people were killed in the Nuseirat camp in November 2024, before which there was an RAF flight in the air. Parliament has refused to respond to questions about whether intelligence from the UK was used in that hostage rescue operation. So even if they are only 4 hostage rescue operations, which frankly I don't find altogether convincing, then there are still major concerns about UK complicity in massive violations in Gaza.
Thank you so much, John, for your strong testimony and demonstrating to us all the contradiction in the fact that the information exists there, but the will to open the information doesn't exist. I was wondering if you had any information in relation to the facilitation of the use of military bases by British military bases, and also in relation to those flights, the cost of that comes from who's paying that cost? Is it private companies, or are they paid for by the British government?
Well, all of the RAF flights will have been paid by the British government. There's been total secrecy about how much they're costing. The UK, there have been questions in Parliament about it, but anything that relates to the RAF intelligence operations over Gaza basically gets stonewalled by the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office, saying we don't comment on intelligence matters. Since these spy flights, the RAF spy flights have been replaced by a private military contractor, well, they're going to be paid through the Ministry of Defence's, presumably through the Ministry of Defence's budget to the contractor, but we still don't know how much is actually being spent on these, which is quite a ludicrous scenario to be in.
Thank you. And the military bases, any information?
Well, sorry, can you repeat that?
On the use of military bases by Israel?
Yeah, well, I mean, RAF Akrotiri has been on Cyprus, has been a key launch pad. I mean, there's been total secrecy around what precisely is happening, but as, you know, Declassified and Palestine Deep Dive and various other media organisations have shown, there's been constant kind of logistical flights going from RAF Akrotiri. The vast majority of the intelligence flights are going there. I mean, it's been used in, you know, attacks on Yemen as well for the refueling. You've had Israeli military jets arriving in England, various different Breeze Norton, for example, but also RAF Fairfield, I believe, which is where Toma Bar arrived recently. So, I mean, there's several different, you know, RAF bases that are either welcoming Israeli military jets or facilitating operations in support of Israel.
And your point also, that the fact that when we are speaking about these violations, we're also not only extending this to Gaza, we're extending this also to Lebanon as well. Is there any information of also British complicity in relation to that?
I'm not altogether sure regarding Lebanon. However, in several of the US military attacks on Yemen over the past 2 years, many of them have been facilitated by the UK government, with either jets going from RAF Akrotiri. Many have gone from RAF Breeze Norton as well. And typically the jets will be Voyager aircraft, which are used for aerial refueling to support the kind of the fleet of aircraft that are going to bomb, and many of those attacks on Yemen have resulted in significant civilian casualties. And it's also worth reminding that, you know, these airstrikes on Yemen have been conducted in no small part to protect Israel from the consequences of its genocide in Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Could I say to the three of you, thank you very, very much indeed for very, very informative, incredibly well prepared and very powerful testimonies today. It's been a big help to us in drawing up the report, so thank you very much indeed. We now move on to the last two submissions this afternoon, both of which are going to be done by Zoom. So the first one is from Charlotte Andrews from the Global Legal Network, followed by Nikos Tremaglitios, from a Cypriot professor of Bases Off Cyprus campaign. Charlotte, you're obviously on the screen now. Charlotte, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. As you can see, we're moving towards the end of the first day's session on this, and we'd like you to make your submission on behalf of the Global Legal Action Network concerning, as you're aware, our inquiry into the legality of British actions in Gaza in particular, and of course issues around the sale of arms and so on. So I look forward to hearing your submission now, and thank you again for coming online.
Thank you so much for having me at this important tribunal. I'm a lawyer for the Global Legal Action Network and also a consultant at Bindman's LLP. And for the last almost 2 years now, I've been part of the legal team representing Al-Haq in its challenge against the UK government's continued decision to license weapons sales to Israel. Just briefly, by way of extremely brief background, Al-Haq started its challenge in October 2023. In September 2024, under threat of injunction from us, the government assessed that its legal obligations necessitated a cessation of arms sales to Israel, but it created a carve-out for UK components for F-35 fighter jets. Al-Haq's challenge was heard in the High Court in May of this year. Al-Haq was unsuccessful on all grounds, but we are currently seeking leave from the Court of Appeal to appeal. I want to begin by saying that it's been really quite shocking to observe how far this government is willing to create legal absurdities, to defy logic itself, to obfuscate, to employ every tool at its disposal in order to keep arming Israel. My testimony will address how, despite the existence of national rules giving effect to the Arms Trade Treaty, the UK government has, to date, been able to continue transferring lethal weapons, which it knows are making their way to Israel, despite clear and overwhelming evidence of atrocity crimes. I'm going to focus on explaining the flawed methodology that the government employed to make its assessments under the arms export licensing criteria, and how that methodology creates an inevitable, or we say predetermined outcome, which is the continued flow of weapons to Israel. So the UK's strategic export licensing criteria state that licenses must be refused if there exists a clear risk that the item might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. The criteria also stipulate that the government must not grant a licence if to do so would be inconsistent with the UK's other international law obligations, including the Genocide Convention. Now, the approach that the UK adopted in order to fulfil its legal obligations was essentially to do an incident-by-incident assessment. So rather than looking at patterns, they would, for example, look at whether one strike on Al-Shifa Hospital was unlawful, but they would fail in their entirety to assess whether decimating the whole healthcare system was unlawful. What's more, at the very outset of the conflict, this government decided, or the government as it then was, the Conservative government, decided that they could not assess whether there might have been violations without information from Israel itself as to what was being targeted and other operational information that Israel might have. They therefore asked Israel for this information, and Israel declined to provide it. The government deemed that that refusal was a reasonable one. This was an approach that was adopted by the current Labour government, and this set in motion the circular reasoning which saw the government repeatedly give the perpetrator of these atrocities the opportunity not to incriminate themselves. The effect of this approach is that no matter what Israel does in the conflict of hostilities, no matter how clear the breaches are, no matter how uniform the international consensus is, this government will not find that any of these strikes even possibly violated international humanitarian law unless Israel tells them its version of events. Al-Haq's case in these proceedings was that it was wholly unnecessary to impose such a requirement on the IHL analysis, because obviously the clear risk test could be assessed through monitoring patterns of attack, through looking at statements of clear genocidal intent by Israeli officials, and generally from drawing obvious inferences from what Israel was actually doing in Gaza. Nevertheless, the government's methodology led to perverse findings. In the course of these proceedings, the UK government has had access to video footage of the sniping and killing of a grandmother as she walked with her grandson, holding his hand, waving a white flag. Even this was not a possible breach of IHL. Likewise, the execution of Palestinians in their hospital beds by Israeli forces disguised as healthcare workers and disguised as healthcare workers and civilians. Again, not a possible breach. Massacre after massacre of children in their beds, not a possible breach. The whole-scale flattening of bakeries, not a possible breach. These are all examples that come from this very litigation, and in many cases, the government's own evidence, which it disclosed in these proceedings. By September 2024, which is the last time we had disclosure in this case, Israel had killed over 40,000 Palestinians and launched over 10,000 airstrikes on Gaza. The UK government had examined just 413 of these incidents, which we say is outrageous. And of those 413 incidents, it found only one possible violation of international humanitarian law. That possible breach was the World Central Kitchen attack that killed foreign aid workers. So that means that 11 months into this most deadly conflict, the UK government had not assessed that a single incident that killed exclusively Palestinians was even a possible violation of international humanitarian law. This, we say, is a calculated blindness to the sanctity of Palestinian lives. What's more, the consequences that flowed from this methodology were extreme. For the first 11 months of this litigation and this conflict, the UK government assessed that there was no clear risk that UK weapons might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of IHL. And that meant that weapons transfers to Israel continued unabated and in fact increased dramatically following October 2023. In September 2024, the UK government reached the assessment that the clear risk threshold was met, but even then it still departed from its own domestic rules in order to create a carve-out such that UK components for F-35 fighter jets still go to Israel if they do so via the international pool. This new decision itself shielded the very methodology from challenge, because by taking a new decision, Al-Haq was now precluded under the domestic rules of judicial review from challenging the prior decisions. Just another way in which the government sought to evade accountability. In respect of the F-35 carve-out, Al-Haq argued that these continued transfers were inconsistent with the duty to prevent genocide, and this engaged the key question in this litigation of whether the government had assessed the risk of genocide. This is how we discovered that despite denying having done so to Parliament, the government had made an assessment under the Genocide Convention, and it had concluded that there was no serious risk of genocide. How, you might ask, could the government possibly have reached this conclusion in the face of everything that was coming out of Gaza and near international consensus on this point? The answer is through its flawed methodology. The government had said that, because of its application of its methodology, it was unable to find evidence of attacks on women and children and evidence of deliberate attacks on civilians in general, and therefore Israel could not harbour genocidal intent in its assessment. So in other words, the UK government stacked their genocide assessment on top of this rigged methodology, a methodology that is not even designed for meeting its basic obligations under the Genocide Convention. The last thing I'll touch on before I close is that, in addition to intentionally employing a flawed methodology, in the context of this litigation, the UK government has taken other steps to frustrate the rule of law and prevent their cooperation with Israel from being properly scrutinised. So, for example, in proceedings like this, there's what's called a duty of candour, which is a duty to disclose all material facts. We specifically asked for a research report that is chillingly entitled, and I quote, "Long-range shootings or shootings of minors," end quote. The UK, in contravention of its legal obligation, chose not to disclose that by way of these proceedings. In addition, this government has sought to introduce delay into these proceedings at every possible juncture. Also, this government has said one thing in Parliament and an entirely different thing in court, as Richard Burgon MP alluded to. And in fact, my colleague Garodo Quinn will make further submission to the tribunal tomorrow, expanding on what we've learned firsthand about how the UK government has itself engineered an accountability gap and how they are now exploiting that gap to enable their support for Israel to continue unchallenged. So in sum, in order to evade accountability for its actions in Palestine and avoid scrutiny of the UK's deep economic, political and military cooperation with Israel, this government has hollowed out its own domestic laws, as well as the procedural safeguards and protections afforded by the Genocide Conventions, the Geneva Conventions and the Arms Trade Treaty. The UK had a proud history as an architect of the post-war international framework, and yet the effect of the UK's current position is to severely compromise that very framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, my colleagues? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that, Charlotte. So just a quick question in relation to the reasoning of the court in their assessment of the F-35 case. Would you be able to give a short comment on that, as well as your own assessment of that, of the court's reasoning and its rationale?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what happened in the case is that the UK government said that the F-35 carve-out was necessary and that removing its parts going to Israel would undermine international peace and security. And it failed in its entirety to submit evidence in open court as to why that was the case. But what happened is there were closed proceedings. So essentially that's proceedings where Al-Haq and Al-Haq's lawyers are not allowed to view the evidence, but there's someone appointed to represent our interests. And in the judgment, the court found that evidence that was submitted in the closed proceedings established the point that international peace and security would be undermined by the removal from that programme. That's one aspect of its findings. Also, generally in judicial review in the UK, the courts afford a great degree of deference to governmental decision-making, and that is especially true where national security is at stake. And because of the way that the government pleaded this case, in that it is core to national security, there was a huge degree of deference that was afforded to governmental decision-making. What the court said expressly is not, we endorse this approach, but actually the proper place for scrutiny is not the courts, it is Parliament. And so it's interesting to follow immediately Richard Burden MP after himself talking about how challenging it is to afford for accountability in the parliamentary setting.
Well, indeed, it's quite unfortunate how stuck we are in a circular go ask the other person type of thing. Would you like to?
My simple question is this. First of all, thank you very much for your evidence. How often do cases of international humanitarian law breaches actually end up with a case taken in a domestic court? I'm not just thinking about the UK, I'm thinking of other places where you've got a very distinguished record of taking up cases in different countries. I wondered if you had any experience on this.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able, I mean, I'll just comment anecdotally, but I think it's extremely rare. In the UK setting, for example, we're obviously the only case, and that's for a number of reasons, including the deference afforded to the courts, but also including how astronomically expensive it is to bring litigation in the UK, and how often this realm of decision-making, not just in the UK, but if we look at the US and other similar jurisdictions, is actually kind of cordoned off. Governmental decision-making as it relates to national security is one of the most hardest, like the most challenging thing to challenge in the courts.
Could I say to everyone else that we've now taken 17 witnesses today. I want to thank them all for the great work they've done, and we have another 12 witnesses tomorrow starting at 10 o'clock, and they're very, very powerful witnesses as well tomorrow. We won't be giving our conclusions today. We will give a brief statement at the end of tomorrow's session, but obviously we need to go away and consider all the evidence, and in some cases supplementary evidence will be offered. But I think all those that are watching online, thank you very much for joining us online, will agree, I hope, with me that this has been a very, very powerful and very worthwhile day, that we've managed to understand a great deal about British involvement in the horrific situation that the Palestinian people are facing in Gaza. I don't know if either of my colleagues want to add anything to that at the moment.
Well, just in short is that we look forward to hearing more, and indeed it's been horrifying as well as mind-blowing to see the whole picture, and we hope as much as possible that also we'd be able to convey this picture as far as we can to the British public, so that they also might be able to see their own governments doing and hold their government accountable as we go forward.
Thank you very, very much. So we adjourn now until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning here, and look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow morning, and all of you online. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience where we've only had some minor technical difficulties, all of which have been overcome by our brilliant team of technical volunteers. Thank you to all the volunteers and all the helpers that have given up so much time today and have offered to do so again tomorrow. Adjourned.